to another insightful session hosted by Qualitative Research Connect, or QLRC. Today's webinar is entitled Digital Ethnographic Methods in a Changing World. Dr. Janet Salmon is a free-range scholar. She edits the Substack newsletters when the field is online and reimagine research. She is the author of 12 books about online research and is currently working on a multimedia design guide for online researchers. She is a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum, Germany, and was in residence in 2024. She lives and works in Boulder, Colorado, in the USA. Let's all welcome Dr. Janet Summons.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from Colorado. It's very early in the morning over on my side of the world, but I'm happy to be here with you this morning. As Darren mentioned, I've been working with online ways of conducting qualitative research for a long time and have written a bunch of books about this topic, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, just to say this is an area that interests me, and I continue to look for examples and opportunities that allow us to use technology to communicate and collaborate and collect data on, for qualitative studies. So today, after this brief introduction, I want to just talk a little bit about kind of the big picture of research design that involves technology, and then to talk specifically about ethnography and digital ethnography and some ideas that I have for working in kind of our changed internet world. So I want to just start by saying in the kind of backbone of my work, I suggest that we need to take a holistic view of research design when we have technology involved, because technology changes everything. I mean, if we were sitting together in a room, we might communicate differently than we do using a tool like we're in right now. How does that change the ways that we need to approach the study? And, keeping in mind things like the varied levels of access and digital literacy that people might have. So, as we're thinking about designing a study where all or part of it will be conducted online, there are a lot of things to think about. And while I think it's important to keep the design process very flexible, at the same time, the more we can kind of think through the options in advance, the better, it will be in terms of clarity for anyone who is reviewing our proposals, or even for participants who are thinking about studying with us. So, with each one of these kind of nodes in the design process, there are lots and lots of questions and lots of decisions to make. And while, in some cases there are, real, say, right and wrong answers to those questions, for the most part, it's really, a decision about what direction the study will take. So, there are a lot of kind of cross links between the different decisions that we need to make. So, as we start to think about ethnography and digital ethnography, that certainly, is the case. So, I wanted to just, I think that it's always important to begin by defining your terms. And this definition by Paul Atkinson, who's written a number of really interesting books about ethnography, talks, it's a broad approach to exploration and analysis based on participant observation and direct engagement of the researcher with the chosen research setting. But it's not just about the field work, it's also the frames of the analysis. So here in this definition, you can see they're kind of melding the methodology of exploration with the methods of conducting the study through observation, engaging with people within a research setting, and emphasis on field work. So then, how does the definition shift when we're thinking about doing it online? So in this definition, they talk about, it's research on about online practices, communications, and offline practices as that are shaped by digitalization, and involves human beings studying other human beings. So here I am definitely talking about human researchers who are studying the human experience, and that's, reflected in this definition. But we'll kind of, think through, whether this definition might be adequate as we move forward. You can see that it's drawing on 2016. So, maybe we will, kind of move forward from that. So I like to, kind of go back to some early writings about the, kind of life on the internet, and what is the field, where we are conducting studies. And so here, I'm drawing on the work of Howard Rheingold, who is the one who actually coined the term virtual community. And I think that it's kind of a, interesting way to think about life online, and the places that we might want to study. And he said, in 1993, which is, in the really early days of online discussion groups, virtual communities are social aggregations that emerge from the net when enough people carry on as public discussions long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. So, going back to the definitions of ethnography, Raymond Madden, who wrote a book called Being Ethnographic, says humans are placemakers and places make humans. It's hard to imagine a human story that hasn't been framed in some way by reference to place. There is something essential about the relationship of humans to place. So, as we think about, well, what is the place of, in the online world, how can we, how does the place of the internet, influence the activities that are taking that are occurring on it? And again, going back to some of the early writings by the ethnographers who started to think about how online community could be studied. And I think digital ethnographers were kind of ahead of the game, because when you think about it, there is not a, say, digital case study or digital phenomenology or digital grounded theory where methodologists have thought through what what that online place had to do with the method for conducting the study, whereas ethnographers right away, started to think about these questions. So, a couple of things that I found interesting from these books, and in some ways, I find that, this work that was published very early, that really captured kind of the vision and imagination for what can be done online, and that at this time where we're at sort of a really turning points about the ways that we interact online, that revisiting those early ideas, there might be some insights that would apply. So in 2000, when Christine Hine published the book Virtual Ethnography, she was asking questions like, how does the internet affect organization of social relationships in time and space? Is it different from real life? Or if so, how do we reconcile the two? And I think, that's something that we are still dealing with. What is that balance between what we do offline, what we do online, and how does that influence the ways that we might conduct research online? What are the implications of the internet for authenticity and authority? Well, I think again that's something that we're still, really dealing with, and in some ways, even more so. In the 2000s, Sarah Pink wrote numerous books, and a couple of the principles that she outlined. One was multiplicity. There's more than one way to engage with the digital, and non-digital centricness. Um, she says, in order to understand how digital media are part of people's everyday worlds, we also need to understand other aspects of their worlds and lives. In doing so, we might focus specifically on those domains where digital media are used rather than on characteristics or use of the media. So, saying like, well, how do we understand, what people are doing online in relation to, other aspects of their lives, and how do we study that? So then, to fast forward to today, when I'm very active online, and this is something that's very interesting to me. But I have to say that, when I hear people talking about the internet or apps or social media, for the most part, they are not using glowing terms. So in one New York Times opinion piece that was like a month or so ago, Ezra Klein, Tim Wu, and Cory Doctorow said the corporate capture of the internet and the way that we went from the dream that Howard Rheingold articulated of a decentralized, user-controlled internet into something that a small number of corporations really run and have enormous power over. People used to have lots of control over their computers, and that turned into a situation where the computers had lots of control over them. And so that's, kind of the world that we're going into, as we're thinking about doing research online. But I think that, given, if we accept that as a given, that with these issues, that people are looking for safe spaces where they can find and interact with people in a meaningful way. And rather than looking at some of the kinds of public, internet-wide, open kinds of communication, that people are gravitating towards what we used to call walled gardens. They're, the more private spaces where members can join and interact, and build those kinds of relationships that Rheingold envisioned. So one of the writers observed, the nature of online social behavior is largely changing from the communications taking place on open platforms to interactions occurring in hidden group-based spaces or closed forums. And they're calling this the new geography of unsearchable small conversations. So, what does that mean for people who are doing research online? Because if we are going to find those kinds of spaces where people are authentically engaged in activities and discussions that we want to study, with the kind of ethnographic interest in culture and community, then, we have the question about access because, obviously, things that are on the open internet are a lot easier to find than those small private conversations. But, one of the things that I also, think about is, and I was kind of trying to tease out the idea that Pink described in those early books as non-digital centricness, and thinking about, well, how do we place and understand, the online interactions, in the larger context of people's everyday lives. And, so Chowdhury says digital ethnography matters because to some extent, digital environments are where our lives are lived, but online practices don't exclude offline experiences that both the ethnographer and the study participants experience in offline spaces. So, as we think about this shift from everything happening in a more public space to things happening in a more private space, then, another trend that I see going along with that is, the ways that people represent their experience, that in those kinds of public spaces, we saw, a lot of kind of more performative writing, showing this very idealized life. And I think, this is still true on many of the social media sites, but I think that some of the new kinds of environments that allow for those private subscriber-based, member-based interactions, that the conversations shift to discussing the real things that people are dealing with in their lives. So, um, again, I think that, what people are looking for when they are, if they want to develop real relationships is trust, the ability to focus, a place where they can really engage, and not only, relationship to the site, that it's welcoming, easy to use, but also that they're engaged and that it's a space that they can build those kinds of relationships. Um, so, one of the things that I think about is the ways that the technology, plays into the study. And I think here's where, we can get at some of that, the question of where in a study, if you're designing, the balance falls between wanting to understand the behavior and the activities and the practices of people when they are online, or to use the online space, as a conduit to reach people and understand what they're doing in the rest of their lives. So, what it may be that more than one of these applies in a given study, but if we're thinking about the technology purely as a medium, then this is just we're choosing this online data collection, as a way to reach people in other parts of the world, to enlarge our sample, to be able to uh, interact with people that, perhaps, coming into a public space for a face-to-face interview is not practical, even if that we had access to them in our local environment. Or are there particular things that we need? So, for example, if I'm doing a study where I, want to use images, photographs, have other kinds of interactions. I want to see the participant. I want to look at the nonverbal cues, etc. Then I might need to choose a specific technology. So if it's just a medium, I don't really care. I'm going to choose whatever technology is easy and accessible to my participants. It might be that I'm using more than one type of technology with different participants, and maybe I'm video conferencing with one person and emailing with someone else, because the goal is simply to reach the people. But if I say, well, I need something in particular, I need to be able to see the person, I want to see their setting. Like you can see my office right now. If I were your research participant, I'm sure there'd be, all sorts of things in my environment that would be a starting point for conversation. Like, what is this diploma, which happens to be my grandfather's diploma? That would be, we could have a whole topic of conversation that would start to build some rapport. So that's one way of thinking about the setting. But another way is to think about this places on the internet where people are discussing and exploring the topics that we are trying to investigate. So, um, this is where, we're looking for the ways to access those kind of private spaces and conversations so that we can observe the way people engage and perhaps to interact with them. And then in the third, which is kind of less the focus of what I'm talking about today, but here's where the technology itself is the phenomenon we're studying. So, we want to know how do people use this technology? What are the patterns of usage and that sort of thing, more of a IT kind of study. So here, we're thinking about, what is the medium that we're going to use to access participants and other sources, and how do we choose the setting? So, one of the things that I think also ties into, these decisions is, as we think about the unit of analysis and the scope of the study and how that plays into, the kinds of methods that we want to use. Are we, even though, I mean, with ethnography, we tend to think of that as being a study of groups, communities, organizations, but we still might have a study where what we want is the individual perspective on that group. Or it might be that we're interested in the dynamics, within the group and the decision-making, leadership styles, the management, the culture of the organization, and those kinds of questions. So, we might, while certainly not, I try to put things on a continuum because it's not like hard and fast rules, but kind of gives us a little bit of a, angle to think about. Um, One of the, important parts on our side, is to think about our position in relation to the things that we want to study. Whether we are insiders or outsiders, I think is not so cut and dry when we're doing research online. We're, often have some connection to the community in order to get access to it, and that might be a good thing. Or it may be that we are too close to the community or too close to the data collection or the problem, and we need to be, more self-aware about the bias we might bring to it. And so, what I suggest in terms of positionality, that, we think about, that the self-awareness, paying attention to self-awareness so that we, think about how we can evaluate both advantages and risks. So, how can we leverage the insider status we have to build trusting relationships, but at the same time, what risks need attention? Are there topics, that we would ignore because we empathize with the population, or, how do we deal with that? And then, to be transparent about our role, whether we are coming from the outside or not, and to think about what time it might take to build relationships if we are coming very much from the outside, so that we can build the trust that we need, or perhaps to understand cultural differences so that we can be respectful in the study. So I wanted to share briefly two approaches to digital ethnography that are very different, and then we'll have time for discussion and perhaps to see which of these might appeal to you if you're thinking about your own research. So in the first, the ethnographic immersion journal from Cosenetz, a few years ago, when I was managing the Method Space site, I had a chance to interview Robert Kozinets, who wrote the book on ethnography, and he contributed a four-part series of posts around this approach. And I have a handout with the links to both of these studies if they interest you and you want to read more about it. But I just wanted to share, so, from the Kozinets perspective, he talks about going into the space and recording your experience in the space. So here's what he says. Early in my online research adventures, I tried jumping into online conversations where I wasn't particularly welcome, or posting lists of questions to forums or groups. The disruptive results and angry reactions I received suggested to me that this kind of participation is often culturally inappropriate. On the other hand, a complete lack of immersion and engagement leaves an online investigation with little more than interpretive etchings of a content analysis. So he suggests that in this method of making regular purposeful visits to this group wherever you have gained access, reading and exploring topics and writing notes in the journal. So you would talk about what you observed at a particular time on a particular date in your own words. So here you're looking at your experience, think almost bringing in kind of an autoethnographic view of your experience online. So you're not interfering with or engaging with other people. You're recording your experience of that. So if I'm studying something like say response to a global problem, well, I'm looking at like, well, how what is my experience of when I go into this conversation, I find that there's a lot of anger, and that's making me feel that this is a controversial problem, so it's my view of the situation. Taking a very different perspective, and I'm not saying these are right or wrong, but giving you two different ways of thinking about it. This article, Digital Diary, Mobile, Multimodal, and Participatory Method of Digital Ethnography, here she's recording multimodal data, text, images, photos, voice recordings, and videos to provide rich insights into participants' experiences and emotions. So she has created a situation with a a group of consenting participants who are prompted to make diary entries, in response to prompts and questions, and to use, whatever tools they want. So they might be artwork, images, writing, different kinds of expressions that people make in their diary entries, which are then later collaboratively reviewed and reflected on in interviews with the researchers. So these diaries offer a platform for researchers and research partners to gain insights and understandings of the material. So this is not, so this is a participatory, active method that would be very much engaging with participants, but, kind of goes back to the question of, or the concept of the walled garden, of creating some, either finding those kinds of conversations that are happening online and gaining access to those sites, or creating, in this case, your own space where people can record their responses to your questions. So two very different kinds of approaches. So I want to stop there and open it up for your questions. And as we think back to this model, and thinking about, well, if we're trying to decide what kind of approach we want, to be very clear about the purpose of the study. What are we exploring? What is are why are we conducting this study? What do we want to learn? And then what's our position in relation to the topic, the potential participants, the cultural setting, the language, even the regulatory, decision making that would go along with conducting research, in that site, and then selecting the method. So here you could see in the two that I gave, we had, from Kozinets, where his observation, very careful, strategic, disciplined observation, recorded in his own voice, or creating, a setting where, we're drawing on the participants' voices. And then, with the information and communications technologies, with those, there are, varied choices that we can make, whether we're going into something that already, is happening online, as the field of study, or creating some environment online where we can interact with people who are experiencing the topics and problems and questions that we want to study. And then to, think, well, who are those sources, or what are those other kinds of materials that we might draw into the study. So here you could see from those two examples, for Kozinets, those sources were, the things that he would read or view in the online spaces that he's visiting, over a period of time to understand. And then with the digital diary method, to select participants who, who represent, I mean, as we have in any kind of purposeful sampling, the people who are experiencing, are part of the culture, part of the community, experiencing the issues that we want to study, and working with them to collect data. So I will pause there, and let's see what kinds of questions we have, because I have not been able to read while I'm talking with you. So Darren, do you want some?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Janet Salmon, for sharing to us the complexity of digital ethnographic methods. So may I request everyone to write your questions through chat with your name and where you're from. You may write the institution you are affiliated with or the country. So while you are writing your questions, we are so excited as the time is getting nearer to invite you to the second Global Qualitative Research Conference happening on September 7 to 9, 2026 at Cebu Technological University, Cebu City, Philippines. And there's good news. This is a hybrid conference. So you can present and participate from anywhere in the world if traveling to the Philippines is not possible for you, especially the price of gas is increasing. Yeah, so don't miss this opportunity to learn from renowned keynote speakers, Braun and Clark, leading experts in qualitative research. And if you're interested in becoming a certified qualitative researcher, QualiBay offers a range of certification courses tailored to your needs. Explore available programs at www.qualibay.learnworlds.com. Be a part of a dynamic global community of qualitative researchers, and we look forward to seeing you on site or online. So I think we have questions here. And for our first question, it is also from Colorado. I don't know if Dr. Maria and Dr. Janet are seeing each other because they are, but Colorado is very big. Yeah, I've been there. Okay. So, first question: how do you define the boundaries of your field site? Or do we follow the trail where it goes when the community you are studying spans multiple platforms? Yeah, group chat that moves between the Reddit, Discord, and X.
Well, I don't think that I can, there's not kind of, I mean, I think that is the job as a part of the research to design is to determine, what the boundaries will be. It would seem to me that part of that is going to come down to what kind of data collection you're going to do and what you would have access to. So, for example, if you were doing the Cozanet style, which is a non-intrusive kind of observation that is centered on the researcher's experience of that site. So we're just going in and recording what we see, what makes us think about how we feel about it. Then we can go kind of anywhere. Whereas if we are going to be recording other people's comments and their expressions to one another, their relationships within that community, then, we need to gain access. We need to get, permission and consent, to do that. So, then we might say, well, maybe we don't, to gain that kind of access to multiple sites, may or may not be possible. So, that there's no one way to make that decision. Part of it, I think, is also going to relate to the sensitivity of the issue. If we're looking at, say, how people are responding to rising gas prices, well, that might not be that that might not be that wouldn't be the same as exploring how people are dealing with being an immigrant, or how people are dealing with abuse or other kinds of or health diagnoses or something like that that would be very personal, where we would want to make sure that we have some greater caution.
Oh, thank you. And I think Debjani Punjab from India has a follow-up question on what Maria had asked. Same as Maria, but mine is what Sarah Pink talks about offline lives. What happens if we end up needing to study two places, one online and one offline?
I'm glad you brought that up because I think, one of the, kind of could be like a whole nother webinar of thinking about using a hybrid approach. So, it might be that, if we have the geographic, physical access to the site, it may be that we would use some online methods because there are some real values to those. Convenience, you can log in anytime. So if I'm studying, people who are busy, nurses, teachers, mothers, people who work odd shifts, then we can schedule it there at their convenience, or people who have a hard time traveling to a physical space, we can interact with them, or we can have the kinds of interactions where, we might say, send out or post, a series of prompts, uh, so that people are responding kind of, today, look at how, you carry out, this kind of task, and they're responding. So think like with that digital diary approach where, they would be uh, kind of recording their answers to questions over a period of time. So we have that chance to kind of almost go into their lives virtually, but then perhaps, to sit down, if we have the access, sit down face to face, or go into the setting where the activity is occurring, and talk with the people and say, okay, well, here's what, as Monica Pomberger described in that mobile diary article, that kind of interview to kind of review, well, here's what you told me, over a 2 week period about how you deal with this topic. Tell me more. How, what happened next? What worked well? How would you do it differently if you had what other resources would you need to do this in a better way? You could have that kind of in person. So I think that, when you are studying something where you have the access to the community, or let's say, for example, you're going to do, in a more classic anthropological approach that ethnography kind of came out of, where, we are going into another country, another community to study, whatever the problem may be. Before we get there, this is where that positionality question is really important. So if I don't know, I've never been to this place, I know some things, but I'm not an insider. Well, how could I use my preparation time and beginning those conversations with people, to start to, so that, in other words, I'm gaining some understanding, as well as, collecting data, before I get to the site to do the on-site observation. So I think, there's, a real value in looking at the kind of the advantages of each type, when you have the chance to do something in a hybrid way. In terms of, even if it is purely online, then, again, all of each one of these questions, there's so many complexities, to think about. Let's say, for example, I'm studying parenting styles. Well, am I interested in how you deal with your actual kids in your actual home, and, in conjunction with your work and other parts of your life? Or am I interested in the ways that people get support and, learn tips, how do you deal with, teething or teenagers or whatever it may be, by interacting with people in an online community, or perhaps, other parents with a child who has a disability or something, how do those parents get support online? So what I'm interested in is the online aspect of parenting versus the face-to-face, or how those two mesh. I mean, there are lots of possibilities. This is why I'm saying at the design stage to try to think through, well, what is the purpose of the study? Do I want to know about how parents interact with their children, or do I want to know how parents get support from other parents by interacting with them online in online community? So, I think that we have lots of choices, and real, opportunities. So again, going back to, I think, the early digital ethnography studies, and even like when you go, like, so I have a handout. I will put the link in the chat, where I pulled out some open access studies. A lot of the digital ethnography studies, from, say, the mid 2000s on, we're situated in social media, because it was like, whoa, this is cool. why, and when I was writing about online interviews, it would be kind of like, well, why bother like going out and collecting, there's already all this data already out there. And now, we think, well, are they real people posting, or is it AI, or is it bots, or is it, somebody who's, is does not really, is not authentically sharing a real experience, or to find, so that, maybe those kinds of, maybe that, you can find what you need in those spaces, but looking for those other kinds of spaces where the more in-depth conversations are occurring, that I think that we are, we're really seeing that. Certainly, I'm on with the Substack, I see such interesting things, book discussion groups and art groups and all kinds of small groups where people are doing what Howard Rheingold envisioned, in the very early days when it was just a text chat forum, and really building relationships that are trusting, learning from each other, that, that's very different than what is, might occur on the more public, open web, where people might be, they don't maybe have the trust to really post very personal expressions.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Janet. I would like to jump to this question of Dana from the US because something like related to what Dr. Janet has discussed. I am Dana from the US. My international relations students want to do ethnography without the expense of traveling, but they often gloss over the differences between in-person and technology-mediated interactions. When is digital ethnography is a good enough substitute, and when is in-person required?
I, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for, that question. I mean, part of it is, what, what you have access to. I mean, if you have the funding to travel and go to the place, where, the activity occurs, and you have access to, that site, then, that may be, the best choice to make. But again, I think that say, choosing to do a study online does give you access to broader. I mean, look at here we are today. We have people from India, people from the Philippines. I'm here in Colorado. It would be very hard for us to. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would cost a lot of money. For us to be together face to face. So it gives us a chance to be more global and kind of multidisciplinary. But I think that one of the things that you mentioned that is really important, and one of the reasons that I emphasize that positionality piece as being really essential, is that if I'm planning to go somewhere, I've got to make travel arrangements. I've got to book a plane ticket. I need to maybe deal with the, visa. I've got to do all of these things. While I am doing that, I'm having to interact with someone, in that place and kind of learn like, well, no, Janet, that would not be a good idea to go and like just go out into that neighborhood and talk to people like that wouldn't be appropriate. People wouldn't You wouldn't be welcome there. You would stand out, and that wouldn't work. Whereas online, there's nobody to tell you that. I mean, and it's very easy. I go like, I think I'll study people in Zimbabwe, like nothing about the place or the culture. You're just like, drop in from outer space into, some site and try to make sense out of it. And you didn't have that kind of the discussions that would go along with planning a visit that would at least give you some, entree or awareness of the culture. So I think it's really important to think like, if I am a total outsider, whether it's to a in-person community or an online community, I need to build in the time to learn about that culture before I'm going to do this study. I mean, that's just, that's kind of baseline. But I don't think that there's there's no way for me to tell someone, well, here are the exact steps to take. Those are the questions that you need to be thinking through, when you're designing a study. And, who do I need as my collaborative partners, that will help me. I mean, if I were going to the Philippines, then I could talk with Darren and say, well, what should I know about this town? What should I know about this community, that will help me to be, able to do, a good job with this study and to do an authentic study. If I'm doing this online, then I have to look for who are those people? Who are the key community members? Is there a moderator? Is there, someone who is a very active participant who understands how this discussion goes and how people might respond or not, as the point from Kozinets of talking about his early approaches of just like, landing in the online community and finding like people weren't that happy to see him there. And I experienced this with students when I taught, where they thought, oh, I've got my questions. I'll just go in there and start asking them. And then it was like, people were not happy, or in one case where someone had gotten permission from the moderator, but had not introduced themselves to the community, and then they were rejected and basically kicked out. And that's the thing about the online, like they can just like, kick you, boot you out. And this person had to go back and redesign the entire study, do something completely different. So that added a lot of time to her dissertation process. So thinking through these questions and in advance is a part of the process. And I think for students, that's part of the learning process.
Yeah, I totally agree, Dr. Janet. And we have a question from Dr. Safari. Thank you for the very informative presentation, Dr. Salmons. How do we decide whether data is public in the sense that we don't need informed consent versus private?
You picks the hard questions. So I think I I have a continuum. It's not in these slides. I'm just going to put this handout link in here. It's in the drive. The kind of rule of thumb that I go by um, is this so one question, first question that I would ask would be, do you need to be a member to be in this discussion? So, there are some places where online, think about like say, for example, the New York Times. I can read the comments. If I want to comment, I have to register. So then, but then the second question would be, what's the assumption of the expectation of the people who are posting? If I post a comment to an article in the New York Times, my assumption would be that anybody who, it's open to anyone to read, that is a public space. So, if as a researcher, if I were, studying, well, how are people responding to, this global emergency? And I'm looking at the comments that people are posting, I could think, well, those are public and it's interesting, some will have the person's real name and a lot of them have a pseudonym. So there's not personal information because, we don't know the identity of the person. So we could say, well, that would be more on the spectrum of a public space. Whereas if I'm going into, the kinds of like, say, in January, I did it was in an art group that where every day we did a different little watercolor exercise, and you had to be a paid member of this group to post your work and comment to it. To go into a space like that, you would say, well, that's a private space because the people registered, joined, and paid to be a part of that online discussion, and they were trusting that when I post my paintings, it's going to be seen by the other people in this group because it's not accessible for others to wander in from the outside. Or think about the space that we're in now. This is a private space. You had to have the URL to get into this meeting. You can't just wander in here off of the web. So, to me, those are questions to ask. And then I would say, well, what kind of data am I collecting? If I'm collecting data that has personally identifiable, even in the metadata, or for example, pictures, video. I mean, if you were using the recording from this, well, you can see my face and other people's faces whose cameras are on. So then, I'm identifiable, and that would be, I think that, in that case, you would want to have the consent. With the digital ethnography, I think, again, it's the sort of continuum thing of saying, well, in some cases it may be informed consent as we generally understand it. In others, it may be more of permission to access, because it could be not only like living participants on the other side of the screen, or users, or community members. It may be that we're looking at archival materials, posted, documents, records that are historical, or perhaps recent past, or long past records. Well, then, we would say, well, what permission do I have? Do I need permission to use these materials, or are these in the in the public in a public space that that where I would be looking at citing and referencing the materials, rather than trying to get a consent per se.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet. I know that there are some, you know, I know if we have time, there must be a lot of follow-up questions to that, because it's so difficult to decide where to get the data. It's easy for us, we would prefer a public one than to ask
Mm.
permission, hassle to ask permission from a group or to be inside the group. Okay, since we still have a lot of questions, and don't worry, these questions will be given to Dr. Janet, and we will post it in our page, in Facebook page, so that your questions will be answered. And once again, thank you, Dr. Janet, for sharing your expertise with us today. We also extend our heartfelt appreciation to all our webinar participants. Your presence and engagement made this session a success. A recording of today's webinar will be available on our website, www.qlrconnect.com, within the next 48 hours. For your certificate of attendance, it is only given to active registered QLRC members. And the timeline to apply for a certificate of webinar attendance is within 7 days. When submitting a request by email, you can email to info@qlrconnect.com. Participants must include their membership certificate number, which can be found at the top left of the membership certificate. Participants, you are no longer required to submit a photo. However, participants must attend the webinar for at least 30 minutes for the certificate to be issued. If you would like to officially become part of the Qualitative Research Connect community, we warmly invite you to visit our website and complete the membership form. And please don't miss our next webinar on May 7, 2026. Thank you once again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from the different parts of the world.